This happened in November of 2022, when I was 23. At the time, I was doing furniture delivery for a small local company while I figured out what I actually wanted to do long term. It wasn't a great job, but it paid enough, and most days were simple. You showed up at the warehouse early, loaded whatever was on the route, and spent the day carrying furniture into places with way too many stairs. Most of the time I worked with the same guy, Ben. He was in his late 20s, funny in a dry way, and the kind of person who somehow never seemed stressed, no matter what was happening. We got along well enough, which mattered because when you spend 10 hours lifting heavy furniture with somebody, even a mildly annoying personality becomes a serious problem fast. This happened on a Friday, late in the afternoon. It was our last delivery of the day. The address was for a house about 30 minutes outside town in a more wooded area. Not totally isolated, but far enough out that once we got off the main road, there were long stretches with no other houses in sight. It had already started getting dark by the time we turned onto the final road. The order was for a sectional couch and a coffee table. When we pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was that the house looked normal from the outside, but oddly empty. Not abandoned, just inactive. No lights on in the front rooms, no cars besides a single SUV, no decorations, no signs of anybody being home, except that one vehicle. Ben looked at the invoice and muttered that this better at least be easy. It wasn't. A man answered the door almost right away. He looked to be maybe in his 50s, wearing jeans and a dark sweater, and he had that overly polite tone some customers use when they're trying to sound relaxed but actually seem tense. He told us to bring everything in through the front, then immediately changed his mind and said it needed to go through the side entrance because the couch was for the finished basement. That was annoying already. He led us around the side of the house to a lower door near the back. The yard sloped down, so the basement had its own entrance. There was one light over the door, and beyond that was just darkness and woods. Ben gave me a look that basically said, "Of course, it's a basement." The guy unlocked the door and held it open for us. The basement itself was nicer than I expected. Carpet, TV on the wall, bookshelves, one lamp on in the corner. But it still felt strange down there. The room was too cold for one thing, and it had that stale smell finished basements sometimes get when no one uses them much. We brought the coffee table in first, then went back for the couch sections. That was when I noticed the second door. It was on the far side of the basement, painted the same off-white as the walls. No window, no decoration, just a plain interior door with a deadbolt installed above the normal knob. Not a huge deal on its own, except it stood out because it looked newer than everything else around it. Ben noticed it too. On the second trip in, while we were setting down one section, he quietly said it was a weird spot for a deadbolt. I just shrugged. People lock storage rooms all the time. The customer must have heard him because he quickly said it was just a utility room and there was nothing interesting in there. It was such a fast response that it immediately made the room feel more awkward. Ben gave one of those fake customer service laughs and said he hadn't asked. The guy smiled, but only for about a second. We kept unloading. The whole time, I had this growing feeling that the man didn't want us down there any longer than necessary. He stayed close by, too close honestly, hovering while we worked. Some customers do that, but with him, it didn't feel like impatience. It felt more like supervision. When we finally got all the couch pieces inside, he asked if we could assemble them in a specific arrangement. We had to, since that was part of the job. but it meant another 20 minutes in the basement. Ben was kneeling by one section trying to line up the brackets when I heard a sound from the other side of the locked door. It was faint, but definitely there. Not a pipe, not the house settling. It sounded like a thump, then a dragging noise. I looked up right away, and Ben did too. The customer noticed both of us react and said almost instantly that it was an old house. That made no sense because the basement was clearly renovated, and the noise had come from behind the locked door, not inside the walls. Neither of us said anything, but after that, the whole energy changed. We finished putting the sectional together in about 5 more minutes. The customer signed the invoice with a slightly shaky hand. Then he asked if we could leave the old couch sitting outside by the side yard for a disposal pickup. Technically we could, but only if it had already been moved out of the house. It hadn't. Ben told him that wasn't part of the order. The man stared at him for a second too long, then said, "Right, of course." We started carrying our straps and tools back toward the basement door. That was when the sound came again. This time, it was clearer. 3 quick knocks from behind the locked door, not loud, but unmistakable. Every hair on my arms stood up. Ben slowly looked at the customer and asked, "You got somebody in there?" The man's whole face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His polite expression dropped for maybe half a second before he forced a smile again. Then he said, "My wife's brother. He's staying with us. He's not well." I remember thinking that explanation should have made me feel better, but it actually made things worse. Nothing about the way he said it sounded natural. It sounded assembled. Ben just nodded and said, "Okay." We went up the basement steps and out through the side door, and the customer followed us right behind. He locked it behind him immediately. I heard the deadbolt slide the second we stepped outside. We got in the truck, and before I'd even shut my door, Ben said, "That was weird as hell." I agreed. We were halfway down the driveway when I realized I had left my work gloves inside. They were cheap, but I needed them, and I wasn't trying to buy another pair myself. Ben sighed and told me to go get them. He added that he wasn't going back in there, so I got out and jogged back to the side door. I knocked, and after maybe 10 seconds, the man opened it only halfway, like he didn't want me seeing in. I told him I'd left my gloves downstairs. He stared at me for a second, then said, "I'll get 'em." Before I could answer, he shut the door. That was the moment I should have just left. Instead, I stood there waiting. From where I was, I could hear faint movement inside the basement. Then, under that, I heard something else. A voice. Muffled, but definitely a human voice, coming from behind that locked door. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of someone speaking quickly. A few seconds later, there was a bang against the door from inside, more desperate than a knock. I backed away. The side door opened, and the man handed me my gloves. His breathing looked slightly heavier now. I took them and said thanks. Then, before he could close the door, a woman's voice from inside the basement yelled something. I only caught part of it. "Don't leave." The man slammed the door so hard it rattled in the frame. I ran back to the truck as fast as I could. The second I got in, Ben looked at my face and asked what happened. I told him exactly what I heard. He didn't even argue. He just pulled the truck onto the road and told me to call 911. I did. I told the dispatcher everything as clearly as I could. Delivery stop, locked basement room, voices, someone yelling not to leave. She asked if we believed someone was in immediate danger. I said yes. We ended up parked at the end of the road waiting for deputies because neither of us felt right just driving off completely. It took maybe 12 minutes. 2 sheriff's vehicles went up the driveway without lights or sirens. About 5 minutes after that, an ambulance was called too. We never saw exactly what happened inside. What we did find out later was that the man's wife had been in that locked room. Not because she was sick, and not because she was dangerous. He had apparently told family members she was planning to leave him, and something in him had snapped. He had taken her phone, locked her in that room sometime earlier that day, and told at least one relative she was resting after an anxiety episode. We only learned that much because a deputy called our company the next week for a formal statement. I don't know how long she had been in there before we arrived. What bothers me is that if we had been faster with the delivery, or if that second noise hadn't happened, or if I hadn't forgotten those gloves, we would have just driven away thinking it was a creepy house with a weird customer. And she would have still been locked in that room. That's the part I still think about. I've had scarier feelings since then in the moment. Random things that spike your adrenaline more. But nothing has stayed with me like that basement. Because it wasn't some urban legend or some stranger in the woods. It was a normal house, a normal delivery, and a normal-looking man. And behind one locked door, something was very, very wrong. This happened in the summer of 2020, when I was 24. At the time, I had just moved to a different part of the state for work. It wasn't anything impressive, just an entry-level office job, but it paid better than what I had before, and I needed the change. Since my lease on my apartment didn't start for another week, the company put me up in a motel on the edge of town. It wasn't a terrible place, but it definitely wasn't somewhere you'd choose to stay if you had other options. It sat right off a 2-lane highway next to a closed diner and a gas station that looked like it had been remodeled sometime in the late 90s and then never touched again. The motel itself was one of those long rectangular buildings with outside-facing room doors and a tiny front office near the parking lot. There were maybe 15 rooms total. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I'd get back from orientation, pick up food somewhere, sit in the room watching YouTube, and go to sleep. The room wasn't great, but it was clean enough, and I kept telling myself it was temporary. The weird part started on the 3rd night, when I got back later than usual, maybe around 9:45. The office light was still on, and the same night clerk I'd seen the previous evening was behind the glass. He was a thin, older guy, probably in his 60s, with grey hair and those large square glasses that made his eyes look bigger than they were. I only remembered him because he was oddly talkative the first time we met. Not friendly exactly, just the kind of person who kept a conversation going too long. When I walked past the office, he stepped out and asked how my stay had been. I said it was fine. Then he asked if I was settling in all right. That phrasing struck me as a little strange since I was obviously just in a motel room for a week. But I didn't think much of it. I said yes and started toward my room. Then he called after me. He said, "If you hear anything unusual tonight, don't worry about it." I stopped and turned around. He smiled slightly and added, "We've had plumbing issues, some banging in the walls." I said okay, and he went back into the office. That comment bothered me more than I wanted it to. Maybe because there hadn't been any reason to say it unless he expected me to hear something. Still, I went to my room and forgot about it for a while. My room was near the far end of the building, second from the corner. The room beside mine had been empty since I arrived. I knew that because the curtains were always open, the lights were off, and there was never a car parked near it. That night, after I got showered and settled in, I did start hearing noises. Not loud ones, just occasional metallic thumps and faint rattling, exactly the kind of thing old plumbing might make. So at first, the clerk's explanation seemed reasonable. Around 11:30, I turned off the TV and got into bed. A few minutes later, I heard a sound that did not come from the walls. It came from outside my door. It sounded like someone dragging their fingers lightly across the metal railing outside. I sat up immediately. The sound stopped. I listened for maybe 10 seconds, then heard footsteps moving away down the walkway. Slow footsteps, not hurried. I got up and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I told myself it was probably another guest heading back to their room and went back to bed. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I heard 3 knocks on the room next to mine. Not my door. The empty room. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I stayed perfectly still, listening. No one answered, obviously. A minute passed. Then I heard footsteps again, this time moving back the other direction. That was when I checked the peephole a second time. I caught a glimpse of someone just as they passed out of view, and it looked like a man in a dark jacket. What stood out was that he seemed to be wearing that jacket even though it was the middle of July and still warm at night. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning when I left for work, I glanced at the neighboring room. Still empty. Curtains open. Bed visible through the gap. No signs anyone had gone in or out. That evening, I got back a little earlier, around 8:30. The night clerk was outside smoking near the office door. He nodded at me and said, "Quiet enough last night?" The second he said that, my stomach tightened a little. I asked what he meant. He shrugged and said, "Sometimes people get turned around after drinking. Wrong room, wrong door. It happens." That answer should have made sense, but it didn't. I had not told him anything about the knocks. I just said, "Yeah, I heard somebody out there." He nodded like that confirmed something for him, then ground out the cigarette and went back inside. That night, I was more alert from the start. I kept the TV on low and worked on my laptop, but the whole time I was listening for sounds outside. At around 10:50, headlights swept across my curtains and a car pulled into the lot. It parked several spaces down from my room. I looked through the window and saw a dark sedan. No logo, no bumper stickers, nothing distinctive. A man got out from the driver's side. Even from a distance, something looked off about the way he moved. He wasn't drunk. If anything, he moved too carefully, like he was trying to avoid drawing attention. He didn't go to the office at all. He walked straight up the exterior stairs at the far end of the building and disappeared from view along the second-floor walkway. I waited to hear a door open somewhere above me. Nothing. About 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside my room again. Slow, deliberate. They stopped near the empty room next door. Then came the same knock pattern as the night before. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. I stood by the door this time, not making a sound. After maybe 15 seconds, I heard the doorknob of the empty room turn once, very gently, then footsteps moving away. I waited until I was sure the person was gone, then called the front office from the motel room phone. It rang 6 or 7 times with no answer. I hung up and tried again. Still nothing. That annoyed me enough to go outside. I grabbed my phone and walked to the office. The lights were on, but the clerk wasn't there. I knocked on the office window. No response. I was about to go back to my room when I heard a voice behind me say, "He steps out sometimes." I turned around and saw a woman standing near the vending machines by the ice maker. She looked maybe in her 30s or early 40s. She was wearing scrubs under a zip-up hoodie, and I hadn't seen her before. She asked if I was looking for the front desk guy. I said yeah. She gave me this weird look and said, "You shouldn't leave your room open." That caught me off guard, because I hadn't said what room I was in, and I definitely hadn't mentioned leaving it open. I told her it was shut. She nodded once and said, "Good," then added, "There's a man who comes by some nights asking for room 12. I asked what she meant. She pointed down the building toward my end and said, "He knocked on mine the first night I stayed here, asked if this was 12. I told him no, and he just stood there for a second, like he was deciding whether he believed me. I asked if she had told the clerk. She laughed a little and said, "The clerk knows." Before I could ask another question, the office door opened and the clerk stepped back inside carrying a bag from the gas station. He looked mildly annoyed to see us both standing there. I asked him whether there was some guy going around knocking on doors asking for room 12. He paused just a fraction too long. Then he said, "Probably someone confused. Happens more than you'd think." The woman looked at him and said, "2 nights in a row." The clerk didn't answer that. He just told us both to go back to our rooms and lock our doors. That was all. At that point, I was seriously considering checking into a different place for the rest of the week, but it was late and I had work early. Part of me still thought maybe this was just one aggressive weirdo mixed with a strange employee. I went back to my room and shoved the small table against the door. I also put one of the empty glass bottles from dinner on the table so it would fall if anyone pushed the door. At around 1:15 in the morning, I woke up to a knock. My heart started pounding instantly. It was my door this time. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. I didn't move. A man's voice from outside said, quiet but clear, "Front desk." I knew immediately it wasn't the clerk. Different voice. Younger. I stayed silent. He knocked again, same pattern, and said, "Need to ask you something about your car." I didn't own a car. I had a company rental, and it was parked on the other side of the lot. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 right then. While the call was connecting, I looked through the peephole. A man was standing just to the side of my door, enough to stay mostly out of view. All I could really see was part of his jaw, one shoulder, and his hand resting low near the frame. He was wearing that same dark jacket. The dispatcher answered, and I started whispering what was happening. The second I spoke, the man must have heard some sound from inside because he stepped back from the door. For the first time, I got a full look at him through the peephole. I had never seen him before. He wasn't hotel staff. He wasn't some drunk guest either. He looked focused, calm, and very awake. He stared directly at the door for maybe 2 seconds, then turned and walked away. Not rushed, Not panicked, just walked. I told the dispatcher he was leaving, and she said officers were already on the way. Apparently somebody else had called too. I'm guessing the woman in scrubs. When police arrived, they found the sedan still in the lot, but the man was gone. He had left the driver's door unlocked, and the keys were missing. One of the officers came back later. He told me they found several motel keycards in the car from other places in nearby counties, along with a handwritten list of room numbers. Room 12 was on the list. So was mine. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about, because I wasn't in room 12. I was in room 11. The next morning I asked the clerk what had been in room 12 before I checked in. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept, and for once he dropped the vague act. He told me a woman had been staying there alone for about a week the month before. She had complained twice that someone kept knocking late at night asking for the wrong room. Then one day she checked out early, without explanation. He said after that, the knocking started happening to other guests nearby. I asked why he hadn't just told us that from the start. He looked embarrassed and said, "Because management told me not to scare people." I left that motel that afternoon and paid out of pocket for a hotel closer to town until my apartment was ready. Nothing happened after that. But what still bothers me is how routine it all seemed to that clerk by the time I got there. Like it had happened just enough times for him to start treating it as one of the building's little problems, same as plumbing noise or a bad ice machine. And if that woman by the vending machines hadn't said anything, I might have opened the door when the man claimed to be the front desk. That's what gets me. Not the knocking itself. The confidence. Like he had done it before, and at some point, it must have worked on somebody. This happened 2 years ago, when I was 34. At the time, I was living alone in a rental house outside Richmond. It wasn't a big place, just a 1-story 3-bedroom in an older neighborhood where the houses had all been built around the same time and mostly looked the same. I had rented it because I was recently divorced and needed somewhere quiet that wasn't an apartment. I worked from home doing insurance claims, so I spent a lot of time in that house, more than I probably should have. The place had one weird feature I never really got used to. The bedrooms were all connected by a narrow hallway that had no windows, so even during the day, it stayed dim unless the hall light was on. At night, that light mattered more than any other in the house. If it was off, the hall became a black strip between the living room and the bedrooms. I usually left it on until I went to bed. I should also mention that I'm not the kind of person who scares easily in my own home. Random noises, house settling, old pipes, all of that usually has a reasonable explanation. I had lived there for almost 8 months when this happened, so I knew the normal sounds pretty well. It started on a Tuesday night in November. I had worked late, eaten takeout in the living room, and spent the rest of the evening half watching some documentary while answering emails on my laptop. Around 11 o'clock, I got up to let my dog out. He was a black lab mix named Cooper. About 9 years old, calm and lazy most of the time. He usually slept through almost everything. That night, when I opened the back door, Cooper stepped onto the patio, then immediately stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood there, ears up, staring into the dark yard. I remember saying, "Go on," because sometimes he'd freeze if it was cold. He still didn't move. Then he backed into the kitchen and stood against my leg, which was unusual enough to get my attention. I looked outside and didn't see anything. The yard was fenced, and the motion light by the garage hadn't come on. I figured maybe there was a raccoon somewhere along the fence line. I shut the door and decided he could wait until morning. Around midnight, I went down the hall to brush my teeth. That was when I noticed the spare bedroom door was cracked open, which stopped me right away. I always kept that room shut. It wasn't dramatic, just open maybe 4 inches. But because I lived alone and almost never even went in there, I noticed it immediately. I stood there looking at it, honestly more annoyed than scared. My first assumption was that I hadn't latched it properly when I vacuumed the weekend before, and the air kicking on had pulled it loose. That kind of thing happens in older houses. So I pushed it shut and went to bed. Sometime later, I woke up for no clear reason. The room was dark except for the faint line of light under my bedroom door from the hall. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I always turned the hall light off before bed. I lay there for a second, still half asleep, trying to remember if I had forgotten it. That was entirely possible. I'd had long days before and done absent-minded things around the house. Then Cooper, who slept on a dog bed in the corner of my room, let out this low sound I had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not quite a growl either. More like the warning sound a dog makes when it senses something but isn't sure what. He was staring at the bedroom door. I sat up immediately and checked my phone. It was 2:17 a.m. I listened. The house was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, nothing moving. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. The hall light was on. The spare bedroom door was open again, this time wider. I just stood there in the doorway, my brain working through normal explanations as fast as it could. Maybe I had not actually shut it earlier. Maybe the latch didn't catch. Maybe I had left the hall light on and was misremembering. All of that was possible, but none of it explained Cooper. He had gotten to his feet and was now standing beside me, stiff, staring straight down the hall. I called his name softly, hoping he'd relax and make me feel ridiculous. He didn't take his eyes off the spare room. I walked to the hall switch and turned the light off. Instantly, the hallway disappeared into darkness except for a faint spill from my bedroom behind me. Before I could even take one step back, I heard a quick movement from inside the spare room, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I hit the light back on so fast I nearly slapped the switch plate off the wall. Nothing was there. The room was exactly what it always was. Empty bed frame, stack of unopened boxes against the wall, lamp in the corner, closet door shut. I actually laughed once under my breath, but it was the kind of laugh people do when they're trying not to panic. I told myself it had been Cooper moving behind me, or the house settling right as I turned the light off. I checked under the bed and opened the closet. I even looked behind the curtains. Empty. Still, I shut the room again and this time locked it. It was an old privacy lock, not very strong, but it clicked into place. I went back to bed and left the hall light on. The next morning, everything felt stupid in daylight. Cooper was normal again. The spare room was shut and locked. I even opened it to prove to myself how empty and ordinary it was. That was when I noticed one of the window latches was undone. That bothered me, not because it meant anything definite, but because I never opened that window. Ever. I checked it from the outside after making coffee, and the screen had a small tear in one corner. That was the first time I seriously considered that someone might have tried to get in. I called my landlord and told him I needed the window replaced. I also asked for the locks to be checked. He said he could send somebody out by Friday. I didn't mention the rest because I didn't want to sound insane over a torn screen. That night I made sure every window and door was locked before it even got dark. I also dragged a chair under the back doorknob, which I know sounds paranoid, but once an idea gets in your head, it's hard to ignore. Nothing happened that evening. Around 10:30, my sister called me, and I mentioned the weirdness mostly as a joke. She immediately told me I should stay with her and her husband for the night. I told her I was fine. Looking back, that was stupid pride more than anything else. I didn't want to be a 34-year-old man abandoning his own house over a loose window latch and a door moving on its own. I went to bed around midnight. This time I know for a fact the hall light was off. I remember shutting my bedroom door, turning off the lamp, then seeing the room go completely dark. At some point later, Cooper's bark woke me up. Not a warning sound this time. A real bark. Sharp and sudden. I sat up, and once again there was light under the bedroom door. My whole body went cold. Cooper was already at the door, barking now and then, not constantly, but enough to tell me someone was there or had been there. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept in my nightstand and stood up. I also picked up my phone and dialed 911 before even opening the door. The dispatcher answered as I stepped into the hall and saw immediately that something was wrong. The hall light was on. The spare room door was open. And at the far end of the hall, near the kitchen entrance, the back door was standing wide open. Cold air was moving through the house. I backed into my bedroom immediately and shut the door. Cooper was losing it now, barking toward the hall. I told the dispatcher someone was in the house or had just been in it. She told me officers were on the way and to stay in the room. Then I heard footsteps, not running, just moving across the kitchen floor. A pause. Then one slow step onto the hallway wood. I cannot properly explain how different it feels hearing footsteps in your house when you know you're alone. I shouted that the police were coming. Everything went silent, and it stayed that way for several seconds. Maybe 5 seconds later, I heard the back door slam shut. Then nothing. I stayed in the bedroom until the officers arrived. They cleared the house, the yard, and the alley behind the fence. No one was there by then. What they did find was worse than if the person had left some obvious clue. In the spare room closet, behind the hanging rods where it was easy to miss at first glance, was a folding chair. It was pulled open and facing the bedroom door, just sitting there. One of the officers asked if it was mine. It wasn't. That was when everything from the previous night clicked into place for me in the ugliest way possible. The movement I'd heard in the spare room, the open door, the undone window latch. Someone had not just tried to enter the house. At some point, they had already been inside it, possibly while I was home. Maybe while I was asleep. The officers believed whoever it was had come in through the spare room window the first night, then either left when they heard me moving around or possibly hidden long enough to slip out later. The second night, they likely came back through the back door after realizing the window would be noticed. I didn't sleep in that house again after that. My sister picked me up around 4 o'clock in the morning, and Cooper jumped into her car before I even had the bag loaded. I stayed with her for a week while the landlord changed the locks and added better window hardware. I moved out 2 months later. Nothing else ever happened, and no one was caught. What stays with me is not the open door or even the footsteps. It's that folding chair in the closet, because that meant somebody had chosen a place inside my house where they could sit quietly in the dark and watch the hallway. Watch my bedroom. Watch me live there. And if Cooper hadn't reacted when he did, I honestly don't know how much longer it would have taken me to understand that I wasn't alone in that house when I thought I was.